Now obviously on your land, where you hunt, public land, wherever, if you're spooking bucks, that's a bad thing. Spooking any deer is a bad thing. But really, there's a lot of steps that need to take place first before we worry about spooking bucks. And at the same time, what I found is if your property and your hunt is set up properly, then really bucks are not that important for when and why you spook them. We're going to go into some reasons why. And I really want you to think this as it relates to your deer hunt and then your deer habitat if you happen to own private land you're working on it this fall. Does really rule the roost. They set the foundation of movement on any property, and that's very important to understand. Typically, you could have that loner mature buck that's out in some 1,000-acre parcel somewhere, and he's antisocial. He doesn't have a craving or an urge to go breed does, and he just stays by himself. He has a little honey hole. He's away from people. But folks, that just doesn't happen very often. And so what I find is it all starts with the ladies. And if you have those does and you have them, keep them happy, and I'm going to discuss how and why, then that's going to set the foundation of movement. And ultimately, it's going to determine your level of success this fall. Now, really, when you look at it, so many people, there's so much just information out there. And I should call it garbage information, bad information, whatever you want to call it, that you have all this buck bed talk out online and how to create buck beds. And I've even provided information for how to create a buck bed, but I do it in the context that you have to have food first, you have to have screening around the food, then you have doe bedding, and then you have buck bedding. So buck bedding is the last step, not the first. Unfortunately, I go to a lot of client parcels where they're working on habitat improvements, building hinge cut bedding areas, or timber stand improvement in general, hoping to get bucks on their land. But if they don't have those other pieces in place first, they're not going to experience those bucks. And that is no different on public land. And I hope that makes sense. Public land is exactly the same. It's the same concepts, it's the same type of movement, often over a broader scale. You have to gauge hunting pressure. But if you do not have the food, the does, then you're not going to have the bucks. And on public land, when you're scouting, you're wasting a lot of time if you're purely looking for buck bedding areas, quote, buck bedding areas, because for one, they're very seasonal. Bucks can shift, and especially on public land where you have a large percentage of hunters and hunting pressure and a lot of generalized random varieties of cover and food that is ever changing. For example, white oaks in September, mid-September, and then it's changing to red oaks somewhere else. And then they might be feeding on greenbrier tops in November, December, depending on what state, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Southern Indiana, Illinois, wherever you're at. Northern Michigan, they might be hitting some red osier, wetland areas, maybe some beech nut crops, beech nuts in Pennsylvania and the big hardwoods I go. Everything is always changing, but it's still the same concepts. Deer are a little bit more nomadic on public land, meaning they're moving here and there in the different herds. But again, it goes back to you have to have those layers, you have to have those does, you have to have the food first, and then you'll find those bucks. And you're either creating that on small parcel management, deer parcels, and when I say small, I'm saying 500 to 800 acres or less. A lot of the parcels I work on, about 50% are 60 acres or less. Those are true small parcels, down to 5 acres. But you can define those movements, you can define this foundation on private land. You just need to look for it on public land, but same exact concept. If you don't have the foundation of does, you're not going to have bucks. Complete waste of time to look for buck bedding areas or try to create them if you don't have the context of the food and does and that consistent movement first. Really cool thing is when you have defined movements, when you have safe does and you keep them safe, you keep the does safe, you keep their bedding areas safe, you keep their food sources safe, then those bucks will follow. And what I found is, even if you spook that buck out of his bedding area, if you allow that core area that includes that movement to food, that first layer of screening around the food, and then does packed as tightly and bedding as tightly as possible during the daylight hours to that food, then you can afford to spook out an occasional buck around that outside, because he's probably going to be back and another one might take its place. But bottom line is, if you maintain the integrity of that doe movement to that food source, you make sure that you have consistent food source all season long, and you make sure the bedding areas for those does are not spooked out. And I can even talk like this. We have a bowl right over here, right to my left side, where we have about 10 to 15 acres, 12 acres of cover that we try to never spook out, and that's those does. We might mess up and spook a buck around the fringes of this area, but as long as we keep that area intact, and those does and fawns can hit those food sources every single day, the food doesn't run out, we don't spook the food, then that's where it sets out that foundation. The cool thing is if a buck is spooked out, and we know this because we shoot bucks, so obviously they're not spooked out, they're not there just as much as a buck that might have relocated a quarter or a half mile away. We've noticed for years on multiple properties, when a buck is shot and killed out of an area, or if he's spooked out of an area, if you have a quality area and you have multiple bucks within the area that you might want to target, then what we find is another buck slots in its place. Doesn't matter if you're spooking them, doesn't matter if you shoot them. They're going to come back in their place because you have high quality movements where does are hitting food consistently every day. They're hitting those food sources an hour before dark. You're not spooking out the food source. That's the worst thing you can do. And let's face it, probably 95% of all hunters with food plots spook out their food plots. And I would say that's a really accurate guesstimate of how many people do that. And they never get to experience these concepts that I'm talking about, because once you spook out the food, that's the first priority. You have food, screening, doe bedding, then buck bedding. So when you spook out the food, you don't have any of it. It's all gone. So that's where it goes back to that foundation of does. If you have a quality foundation and you have quality micro movements, we have a movement right behind me that comes right through here. There are traditional rubs all around here every single year. And it's because bucks are bedding around the corner behind does. They follow them in, and it doesn't mean that a certain buck is here every single day, but he's here often throughout the season. But when you get rid of those does and fawns and you don't have that movement, I don't think he's attracted to this area either. You have to protect the core. As long as you maintain that core movement where those does and fawns feel secure every single day, that's the first step in attracting and shooting mature bucks on a regular basis. Sure, you can have those stands where it's a random funnel or a pinch point, a bench in the woods where you can shoot a rutting buck every single year, some mature buck. But I want you to have consistent success all season long. And for that, you need to protect those does and those doe bedding areas all season long. That's that foundation. You protect that core of that movement on your land. You protect that movement and multiple movements. Around here, it's like a giant funnel. We have does heading to food right behind the camera, up high, over straight out in front of me, down low, and then to my left, up high. We have 3 different lines where deer come into. And so if we protect all 3 of those, and this is just on 30 acres going out to a 10 to 12 acre valley where we have a few acres of food, literally about 2 1/4 acres of food, so not much. But we protect that funnel of daylight movement where does and fawns are moving to those food sources every single afternoon, and then those bucks just slot in. So while bucks, you know, and you can judge a property by what percentage of the older bucks in the neighborhood it's attracting, and during the daylight hours. Unfortunately, about 95% of all parcels are not attracting the daylight attention or focus of mature bucks on a daily basis. But if you attract the daylight attention consistently of the doe and fawn groups in your area on a daily basis, then those bucks will follow. A great sign of a property isn't only the mature bucks. You have to have the defined doe movement first. Definition of doe movement, definition of consistent doe movement. And again, it goes back to, I talk about this all the time, it's not that you need as many does as possible to have as many bucks as possible. Instead, there's a balance. And I do this all the time, but number of does right here equals a certain balance of mature bucks or bucks in general that you can have on your land. When this number of does increases above that balance, the number of bucks goes down. And I'll just use, it's helpful a lot to think in terms of extremes. But let's say you have 100 does and fawns on this 30 acres of cover. Obviously, there is 0 room left over for bucks. So you have to have a balance, and we talk about that, you know, no doe factories, making sure your summer food is not attracting too many does during the summertime. That's the first step in herd reduction. If you have too many does on the land, get rid of the summer food. That's always the first step. It's not trigger control. Trigger control is second, and often a sign that your habitat is poor, your hunting methods are poor, something is going wrong if you have way too many does on your land, but it all goes back to those summer food sources. But again, you have to protect that core, and that will equal those defined doe movements every single day If you have the defined doe movements, then bucks will follow. They'll slot in if they're killed, they'll slot in if they're spooked. And so really the attention and the risk of spooking bucks, really, if you spook the does out, you spook that food source out, you're not going to have those bucks anyways. So look at it in steps. You have to have those steps first, then you have the bucks. And let's face it, there's very, very few parcels that are attracting the daylight attention of mature bucks. So if you are the one that has the unpressured, consistent, defined doe movement every single day on your land, you're going to attract those bucks, especially if you're hunting appropriately, not spooking them out. And finally, on a great property, it's not just a sign that the mature bucks are easy to hunt, but it's a sign that the does are easy to hunt. When I hear stories about, boy, that old doe, she was 8 years old, we finally got her, probably really bad habitat connection and probably really bad hunting tactics, because mature does, fawns, doe family groups, they do the same dang thing every single day. You can count on it. They're very, very consistent. You can't count on a mature buck to bed in this exact location and move on exact this trail, or there wouldn't be any mature bucks out there. And mature, I'm talking as relative. You know, in some areas of the country, a mature buck might be a 2-year-old. I've literally been to client lands that in 7 years they hadn't seen an antlered buck on their land before I arrived. In 7 years during the daylight. Think about that. I mean, there's so many people that are passing up. I know people out there that pass up 4-year-olds in an afternoon, or 10 3-year-olds, whatever, and they're waiting for that certain 5 or 6-year-old to pop out. You know, that's more the fantasy states and the fantasy hunting areas. But there are areas out there where a 2-year-old buck really is the top end, a 3-year-old buck. So I'm just talking your top ends. Mature is all relative to the area. Mature bucks are a great sign that your property is doing well. But the true test, and I talk about this in my web class series that's coming up towards the end of April, the true test, one of the 7 tests of your property land that is doing really well, is that your land is producing the consistent movement of doe family groups, so that when you want to take a doe and you think your population is too high, you can just go in and take 1 or 2 or however many you need. 2009 or 8, I can't remember the exact date, we shot 9 does in one afternoon, my hunting buddy of mine, Skip Rudder, and I, in about 5 hours of hunting. And it was because we had that consistent doe movement, moving to our food plots. It was in early December. We'd allowed that movement to take place since late August when the crops started coming in for our food plots. We hadn't spooked it out. And for that, we always had great buck hunting on that land. But it all started with, we had to have the consistent doe movement. If we didn't have that, we not only would have not had the opportunity to shoot 9 does in one day, because we had about 40 to 45 does on the land. We needed to drastically remove a few that year. There were a lot of years we shot 0, 5 or 6 or 7, 2 or 3. But on that year is the most we shot, and we needed to at that time. But it's not only that, it's that you'll have great buck hunting even if you spook a buck out or 2, because you'll be that 5% parcel in the area that attracts the mature buck attention during the daylight out of all parcels. There's very few that do that. You'll own that parcel if you own that consistent, unpressured doe movement, and you work to minimize and find a balance of the number of does and bucks on your land. And again, if you spook a random buck or 2 around the edges, another one should slot in. If you shoot one, we find a lot of times one slots in, and you'll not only have a great herd for your efforts by working on that core and that definition of doe movement, but you're going to have a great hunt.